My name is Elena Mercer. I'm 34 years old, and 6 years ago, my younger brother told my parents I had been fired for stealing from the hospital where I worked. He said it on a Tuesday night. I know that because I was sitting in a vinyl chair outside room 412 at St. Catherine's in Richmond, holding a paper cup of coffee that had already gone cold, when my father's name lit up on my phone. The fluorescent lights above me were humming. A floor machine was whining somewhere down the hall. My scrubs still smelled faintly like antiseptic and cafeteria coffee. I almost smiled when I saw his name because for one stupid second I thought he was calling to ask how I was doing. Instead, the first thing he said was, "Don't lie to me." I remember sitting up straighter, the paper cup bending in my hand. "Dad? You should be ashamed of yourself," he said. His voice was low and hard in that way that meant he had already decided the truth before I opened my mouth. "Your brother told us everything. There are moments in life when your body understands danger before your mind does. That was one of them." My stomach dropped so fast it felt like missing a stair in the dark. I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." He gave a short laugh. Not a warm one. "Of course you do. You lost your job. You've been lying for months. David said they marched you out. He said there was an investigation." I looked through the glass window into room 412. My friend Nora was asleep in the hospital bed with an IV in her arm and a knit blanket over her legs. Her skin looked almost gray under the lights. She had stage 3 lymphoma and had started her second round of treatment that week. I had been sleeping in hospital chairs and showering in the family locker room downstairs because she didn't have anybody else nearby. I pressed my fingers against my forehead and said, very carefully, "Dad, that is not true." My mother got on the line then. I could hear her breathing before she spoke. "Elena," she said, and there was something worse than anger in her voice. Disgust. "Your father and I have defended you for years. Do you know how humiliating this is?" I remember staring at the scuffed toe of my shoe because it was suddenly easier than thinking about my own mother saying the word humiliating like I was a stain she'd have to explain to other people. "Mom, please listen to me. I didn't get fired. I took leave. Nora is sick and My father cut in. "David said you'd make up some sad story." I didn't speak for a second after that. I just sat there with that bent paper cup in my hand, listening to the machines in the hallway and my own pulse in my ears. Then I said, "You called me to accuse me, but you never asked me one question." "That's enough," my father snapped. "Until you're ready to tell the truth, do not call this house." And then he hung up. That was how it happened. No scene at a holiday dinner. No dramatic explosion in front of relatives. Just a call in a hospital corridor, my father choosing my brother's story over my voice in less than 4 minutes. If you're listening to this somewhere late at night, or while you're folding laundry, or sitting in your car because you needed a minute before going inside, leave a comment telling me where you're hearing this from. I always wonder where these stories land. I didn't cry right away. That's the part people don't understand when they imagine betrayal. They think it arrives with tears or shouting. Mine arrived as stillness. I set the paper cup on the chair beside me. I looked at the dark coffee stain on the lid. I read my father's name in my recent calls twice, like maybe the screen itself would explain what had just happened. Then I put my phone face down and went back into Nora's room because she needed water and her lips were dry. That was always the shape of my place in the family. Whatever was happening to me had to wait until I was useful again. I grew up in Chesapeake, Virginia, in a 2-story brick house with white shutters and a front yard my mother cared about more than any living thing inside it. My father, Warren Mercer, owned 3 regional auto parts stores and liked to describe himself as self-made, usually to people who had not asked. My mother, Janice, ran his office books from home and arranged her life around appearances with the kind of devotion some people reserve for faith. We were not wealthy enough to be impressive, but we were determined enough to look that way from the outside. And then there was David. David is 3 years younger than I am, which meant that in every family story he was somehow both the baby and the future. He had my father's easy grin, my mother's talent for saying just enough to charm people, and a gift for taking up space without ever seeming rude for doing it. Teachers adored him, coaches praised him. My aunts called him that sweet boy well into his 20s, long after he had become a man who borrowed money like it was his birthright. I was the older daughter, the reliable one, which sounds flattering until you live inside it. Reliable means people expect you to bend. Reliable means you are useful in the background. Reliable means they don't ask whether you're tired because they have already decided you will keep going. When I was 10, David forgot his trumpet at home before the spring concert. My mother made me miss my own spelling bee finals to drive with her and deliver it. I remember sitting in the auditorium lobby in a church dress with a paper number tag still pinned to my chest, while she fixed his collar and told him not to worry, that of course we would make this right. No one asked how the spelling bee had gone. When I was 16, I won a statewide science scholarship. My father congratulated me at dinner without looking up from his plate. 2 weeks later, David hit the game-winning shot in a district semifinal, and my mother had the newspaper clipping framed. That was the family pattern. Nothing I did was ignored exactly. It was just reduced, folded smaller, placed neatly to the side. And I made the mistake a lot of quiet girls make. I thought if I worked harder, if I was calmer, if I caused less friction, eventually somebody would see me clearly. I went to nursing school because I liked the work and because I was good at it. Not in a showy way. I was good at remembering details, noticing when someone's pain had changed even before they said so, staying steady when other people started to panic. The first time I told my parents I wanted to specialize in trauma care, my father said, "You always were built for cleaning up other people's messes." He meant it as a joke. My mother laughed. David smirked into his drink. I laughed too, because that is what I did back then. I helped people finish sentences that hurt me. By 28, I was a charge nurse in a busy emergency department in Richmond. I liked the pace. I liked the clarity of the work. Someone came in bleeding, scared, in pain, and there was no room for performance. Either you knew what to do, or you didn't. I loved that about it. I loved that competence mattered more than charm. My family, of course, barely understood what I actually did. At Thanksgiving, my mother would introduce me to people by saying, "Elena works at a hospital," in the same tone she used to say someone worked at the post office or sold patio furniture. If relatives asked questions, she'd wave her hand and say, "She's always been the practical one." David, meanwhile, had floated through 2 unfinished business ventures and a sales job he talked about like it was private equity. At family dinners, he liked to lean back in his chair and explain the market to my father using words he had picked up from podcasts. My father listened as if he were hearing a language of kings. It would almost be funny if it hadn't cost so much. Nora came into my life the year I turned 30. We started on the same shift and became friends the way adults do when they're too tired for drama and honest enough to recognize themselves in each other. She was a respiratory therapist, divorced, funny in a dry and specific way, and one of the only people I'd ever known who could tell I was upset before I had decided to admit it myself. When she got sick, it happened fast. Fatigue, then bruising, then tests, then words nobody wants attached to someone they love. She had a teenage son in college out of state and parents who were both gone. There wasn't some big noble speech where I declared I would take care of her. I just started staying later. Then I brought groceries. Then I was managing appointments and medication schedules and sleeping on her sofa twice a week. Eventually, my supervisor pulled me into her office and told me, gently, that if I needed leave, I should take it before I burned straight through the floor. So I did. Properly. Paperwork. HR forms. Approved medical caregiver leave. My position protected. Everything documented. I did not hide any of this. I told my mother first. She was unloading groceries when I called. I could hear cabinet doors closing in the background. "Oh," she said after I explained. "That sounds intense." "It is," I said. "Nora's treatment starts Monday." There was a pause. Then, "Well, don't let this turn into one of those situations where people take advantage of your kindness." That was my mother's version of concern. She could not imagine sacrifice unless it came with manipulation attached. I told David a week later because he had texted asking whether I could lend him $600 for just a few days. I said no, and I told him why. He called me immediately. "So you're not working right now?" "I'm on leave." "That's basically not working." "No," I said. "It's approved leave." He made a humming sound that told me he had already translated my life into whatever version was most useful to him. "You always do this," he said. "Do what?" "Make things more dramatic than they are." I was standing in Nora's kitchen with her insurance forms spread across the table and a pen in my hand. I remember looking at the magnet on her fridge shaped like a peach and thinking, with perfect clarity, that I was too tired for that conversation. "I'm hanging up now," I said. He laughed. Touchy. That should have been enough. It should have told me exactly what I needed to know, but there are some family dynamics that take years to stop hoping your way out of. The call from my parents came 3 days later. After they hung up, I texted David. "What did you tell them?" He replied almost immediately, "The truth." I wrote back, "You know that's a lie." Then the typing bubble appeared, disappeared, appeared again. "You always need to be the victim." That message sat on my screen while I stood in the dim light of Nora's room. She was awake by then, looking at me over the blanket, her face drawn and tired. "You look like somebody died," she said softly. I pulled a chair closer to her bed and sat down. "My family," I said, "just made a decision." She watched me for a second, then she nodded once, like she understood more than I had actually said. And that was the beginning of it. Not the whole collapse. That came next. The blocked calls, the unanswered emails, the letter that came back unopened in my mother's handwriting. The exact speed with which one lie can become a family history if the right people are comfortable believing it. But that night, in that hospital room with Nora half asleep and rain ticking faintly against the window, I understood something I had spent most of my life refusing to name. David had not ruined me with one story. He had simply used a door that had always been unlocked. I sat there until after midnight, listening to the monitor beep and watching the city lights blur against the glass. My phone stayed face down in my lap. I did not call my parents back. I did not send some long, desperate text explaining the paperwork, the leave, the schedules, the truth. Not yet. I just sat there and let the shape of the betrayal become clear. Because once you finally see a pattern for what it is, you cannot go back to calling it misunderstanding. And 6 years later, when my brother walked through a pair of hospital doors looking for help, that was the part I remembered first. Not his lie, not even my parents choosing it. I remembered how quickly they had all found it convenient to erase me, and how little they understood about the woman I became after that. Over the next week, I did everything a reasonable daughter would do if she still believed reason mattered. I called my parents 12 times in 4 days. The first 2 calls rang until voicemail. By the third, my father's phone sent me straight to a full mailbox. My mother answered once, listened to 3 sentences, and said, "I cannot do this while your father is this upset," before hanging up. After that, her number was blocked too. I sent 1 short email and 1 long one. The short one said exactly what had happened. Approved caregiver leave. Hospital documentation available. No termination. No investigation. Please call me. The long one had attachments. HR, approval, leave dates, my supervisor's contact information. A note from Nora's oncologist confirming she needed support during treatment. I did not send those things because I enjoyed defending myself. I sent them because somewhere deep down, some younger version of me still believed that if I laid out the facts neatly enough, my parents would be embarrassed by how fast they had judged me and come back. Neither email got a reply. Then I mailed a letter. I bought a pale blue card from the hospital gift shop because it was all they had that didn't say, "Thinking of you" in silver script. I wrote it in the cafeteria during a half hour when Nora was asleep, and I could trust the nurse on the floor to call me if anything changed. My handwriting was too neat because I was trying not to shake. I told them I loved them. I told them David was lying. I told them I had done nothing wrong. I told them they could call my supervisor, my leave coordinator, anyone. I told them I knew they were angry, but anger was not the same thing as truth. Then I mailed it certified because I wanted proof it had arrived. 5 days later, it came back to me unopened. My mother had written, "Return to sender" across the front in black marker so hard the pen had dented the envelope underneath. I remember standing at Nora's kitchen counter with that envelope in my hand. The dishwasher was running. Rain was tapping against the sliding glass door. The black letters on the envelope looked thick and final, like they had more weight than paper should be able to carry. I set it down beside the fruit bowl and just looked at it. That was the moment I stopped expecting my mother to rescue me from my father's decisions. There's a particular grief in realizing the softer parent is not softer at all, just quieter. I called my Aunt Marianne after that. She was my mother's older sister, lived in Norfolk, and had always had 1 foot inside the family and 1 foot just outside it. She was not warm in an obvious way, but she paid attention. When I was 13 and everyone at Thanksgiving forgot I had cut my hand helping in the kitchen, she was the one who brought me a clean towel and butterfly bandages. When I graduated nursing school, she sent flowers without making a performance of it. I told her everything in one long rush while sitting in my car outside a pharmacy. She listened, really listened. Then she said, "I'll call your mother." I believed her. I thought that would matter. She called me back that evening and her voice was tight in a way I had never heard before. "Your mother says David showed them messages." "What messages?" She wouldn't say. She just kept repeating that they had proof and that you've always been dramatic when you're cornered. I looked out through the windshield at a woman loading groceries into a minivan and thought, with a kind of detached clarity, there it is. There's the family script. Not liar, not wrong, dramatic. That was always the word they used when they wanted to turn my reality into inconvenience. I asked Marianne if she believed me. She didn't answer right away, and for half a second I was scared she wouldn't. Then she said, very plainly, yes. I still remember the relief of that. Not because it fixed anything. It didn't. But because when you have been cast as unreasonable long enough, one calm person saying, I believe you can keep you from doubting your own memory. She told me she would keep trying. She did. Twice more, I think. But my mother stopped answering, and my father told her, according to Marianne, that Elena made her choices. That phrase followed me for years. Elena made her choices. As if choosing to help a sick friend had become a moral failure. As if stepping away from work for a documented reason was equivalent to disgrace. As if the family needed a clean story more than it needed its actual daughter. And David understood that better than anyone. He always had. If you want to understand him, you have to understand that he was never reckless in the obvious way. He wasn't the kind of man who smashed furniture or shouted in restaurants or got arrested for fighting outside bars. Men like that are easy to identify. Families know what to do with them. David was something much more convenient. He was polished, funny. The kind of person who made eye contact at exactly the right moment and remembered your dog's name. The kind of man who could borrow money while making you feel honored to help. He had charm where I had steadiness, and in my family charm always won. Growing up, if David forgot an assignment, my mother called him overwhelmed. If I got quiet, she called me moody. If he changed majors twice in college, my father said he was exploring his options. When I turned down a weekend trip because I was covering a double shift in the ER, I was told I needed to learn balance. It sounds small when you list it out. That is how these patterns survive. They are built out of 1,000 small interpretations, each one survivable by itself, until one day you realize every version of you that reaches your family gets translated into something less flattering than it was. By the time I was 31, David had moved back to Chesapeake after a sales job in Atlanta ended under circumstances nobody ever explained clearly. He told people he wanted to recenter. What that meant in practice was that he started spending more time at my parents' house again, helping my father look at numbers for the business and eating dinner there 4 nights a week. My mother loved it. She said the house felt full again. That was the season when their version of me disappeared most completely. I know this because Marianne told me things slowly, over time, usually in a low voice, as if speaking too loudly might make the facts uglier. At Christmas that year, my mother apparently told relatives I was having some personal difficulties and needed space. By spring, David had upgraded that to Elena hasn't really gotten back on her feet. One cousin asked whether I was still in healthcare and was told, not exactly. Not exactly. That was the other family phrase, a lie softened into respectability. Meanwhile, my actual life kept moving, because real life always does, even while someone else is busy rewriting it behind your back. Nora got worse before she got better, then worse again. There is no elegant way to say that. Illness doesn't care about narrative timing. Some mornings she was strong enough to complain about hospital pudding and ask me to stop organizing her mail like a woman twice her age. Other mornings she sat on the edge of her bed, trying to catch her breath after walking from the bathroom. I learned how to count pills without looking at the labels twice. I learned which nausea crackers she tolerated and which ones made her angry on sight. I learned how long her silence meant exhaustion versus fear. Those months changed me in ways my family would never have recognized because they had never asked what kind of strength looks quiet from the outside. Eventually, I went back to work. Not dramatically. Not in some triumphant montage. I met with HR, sent the required documents, got reinstated to my unit, and returned to 12-hour shifts with my badge clipped to my scrub top and an ache in my chest I did my best to ignore. My supervisor hugged me in her office the morning I came back. Then she handed me a revised schedule and a coffee and said, "Go be useful." There are some forms of love that do not announce themselves as love. They show up as respect, structure, people trusting your competence enough not to make your pain the center of the room. I found more family in that emergency department than I ever had in my parents' house. That was where my hidden life really began to take shape. Not hidden because I was secretive. Hidden because no one at home cared enough to ask. I became the person new nurses came to when they were about to panic but didn't want anyone to see it. I handled triage nights that left other people pale and quiet. I trained in trauma intake, then in crisis coordination, then in patient flow management for mass casualty events. I learned how to keep a room steady, how to speak in a tone that made frightened people listen, how to make decisions while alarms were sounding and somebody else was crying 3 feet away. The first time a surgeon I respected told me, "You're wasted if you stay exactly where you are," I laughed because I thought he meant I should take fewer extra shifts. He meant leadership. I didn't tell my family. That's important. Not because I was hiding success from them, but because by then I understood something humiliating and freeing at the same time. Good news only becomes intimate when it is safe. And they were not safe. By then I had stopped sending updates, stopped trying to hand them proof of my life, stopped composing imaginary messages in my head. I didn't block them. I didn't make speeches. I just withdrew from the labor of explaining myself. People call that giving up. It wasn't. It was conservation. There is an exhausting kind of hope that eats years of your life. I was finally learning to live without it. About 18 months after the call in the hospital corridor, I met Daniel. He was not dramatic, thank God. He was an architect who came into the ER with a split eyebrow after walking into a job site beam while arguing with a contractor. He was embarrassed, funny about it, and held still while I cleaned the cut. He had a navy wool coat folded over his lap and kept apologizing for bleeding on it. When I asked whether anyone was coming to pick him up, he said, "My pride, eventually." I smiled in spite of myself. He came back 2 weeks later with coffee for the unit and a thank you card addressed to the nurse with the devastatingly unimpressed face. One of my coworkers laughed so hard she had to lean against the cabinet. I kept the card in my locker for months. Daniel was the first person I dated who did not treat my reserve as mystery or challenge. He treated it as information. If I was quiet, he assumed I had a reason. If I said I was tired, he believed me. The first time I told him the truth about my family, not the short version but the real one, he didn't interrupt. He didn't offer strategy. He just listened all the way through and then asked, "Do you miss them? Or do you miss being loved correctly?" I had never heard the difference put so plainly. That question stayed with me. Because by then, if I was honest, what I missed most was not my family as they were. It was the idea that one day they might become the people I had needed when I was younger. But while I was slowly building something solid in Richmond, David was still living inside their house like the favored son had simply returned to his proper orbit. Marianne told me he had started helping more with the business. Then she mentioned one afternoon, almost casually, that my father had co-signed a loan for him. I remember going very still when she said that. Why? She gave a short, tired sigh. Because apparently David is getting into commercial property. Commercial property. That sounded like exactly the sort of phrase David would borrow and wear like a costume until somebody else had paid for it. I asked whether my father was sure. Marianne was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your father thinks believing him is the same thing as supporting him." That line came back to me years later in a hospital hallway, and not because of the money. Because that was the core of everything. In our family, belief had never been earned through evidence. It was allocated through loyalty and comfort. David got belief because believing him preserved the family picture they preferred. I lost it because telling the truth would have required them to revisit themselves, and that was the one thing they were never willing to do. Not then. So I built a life in the space where their approval used to be. I worked. I slept. I loved Nora through the rest of her treatment. I learned how to trust people who had not trained me to expect dismissal. I moved into a townhouse with Daniel that had a narrow kitchen and terrible closet space and windows that let in good morning light. We bought a secondhand dining table off a teacher in Glen Allen and spent one Sunday putting it together on the floor while eating takeout Thai food out of the cartons. No one in Chesapeake knew. No one asked. And that was fine. Better than fine. It was peaceful. Until the day David reached too far. Because lying about me to my parents was one thing. Trying to use my name for something bigger was another. And when I found out what he had actually been building behind the scenes, I understood that the story he told about me had never only been about shame. It had been about making sure I stayed far enough away not to notice what he was doing. I found out by accident. That's how most family truths arrive when someone has spent years counting on your silence. Not through confession, not through courage. Through a paperwork error, a misplaced assumption, a detail that lands in the wrong hands at exactly the right time. It was a Thursday in late September, warm for Virginia, the kind of sticky heat that makes the hospital parking garage smell like concrete and rain even when the sky is clear. I had just finished a 12-hour shift and was sitting in my car with the engine off, trying to gather enough energy to drive home, when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't know. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Hello? A woman paused, then said, Is this Elena Mercer? Yes. This is Lauren Pike from Tidewater Business Bank. I'm sorry to bother you after hours. I'm calling to confirm a guarantor detail on a commercial application. I sat up. I think you have the wrong person. There was a small shuffle of paper on her end. I have Elena Mercer listed here as secondary guarantor for Mercer Redevelopment Holdings, Chesapeake address on file for prior family residence. The application references a sibling business relationship and no, I said, sharper than I meant to. I'm not connected to any application. I haven't signed anything. Silence. Then, very carefully, she said, I see. The temperature inside the car seemed to change. Not physically, just inside me. That instant shift when your body realizes something is wrong before your mind has built the full shape of it. I asked her to repeat the company name. She did. Mercer Redevelopment Holdings. The kind of name David would choose because it sounded expensive and legitimate without meaning anything at all. I looked through the windshield at the top level of the garage. A young resident in wrinkled scrubs was walking to his car with his shoulders bent from exhaustion. Somewhere nearby, a car alarm chirped once and then stopped. The whole world stayed ordinary, while my brother's name rearranged itself in my head next to mine. I need you to listen very carefully, I said. I have never heard of that company. I have never guaranteed any loan for anyone. I do not consent to my name being attached to anything. The woman's tone shifted immediately. Professional, alert. Understood. I'm going to note that now. For your protection, I recommend you monitor your credit and consider submitting an identity fraud report if you believe your information has been used without authorization. I asked how my name had appeared on the application. She hesitated, not evasive exactly, but careful. I can't disclose internal review details. What I can say is that your name appeared in supporting documents. Supporting documents. That phrase sat cold in my stomach. We ended the call. I didn't start the car. I didn't call Daniel right away. I just sat there with my phone in my hand, staring at the steering wheel, while the implications lined themselves up one by one. David had used my name for something financial, which meant he had my old information, maybe my social, maybe forged signatures, maybe documents he had no right to touch. And if he was comfortable doing that, then the lie about my job suddenly looked different too. Not random cruelty, not sibling jealousy on its own. Distance. He needed distance around me. Needed my parents convinced I was unstable, dishonest, unreachable, so that if anything messy surfaced with my name attached, no one would call me first. They would assume the mess belonged to me. That realization was so clean it actually calmed me. Not emotionally, my hands were shaking, but mentally, I was calm in the way I get calm in a trauma room when everybody else is panicking. Things became procedural, sequence-based. What happened? What can be proved? What has to be preserved? I called Daniel. He answered on the second ring. Hey, you okay? No, I said, but I need you to just listen for 2 minutes before you say anything. He did. I told him about the bank call, the company name, the guarantor reference, the supporting documents. I heard the quiet change in his breathing halfway through. Not surprise. Focus. When I finished, he said, Come home. Don't call your family yet. That was the exact right thing to say. By the time I got home, he had my laptop open on the dining table, my credit reports pulled, a legal pad beside his elbow, and a glass of water waiting for me. Not wine, not comfort theater, water. Structure. That is one of the many reasons I married him. We spent the next 3 hours going through everything. There was no completed loan in my credit history, which meant the bank had flagged something before it closed. That was good. But we found a hard inquiry from a lender I had never contacted and a business registration search tied to the Mercer name that led to a recently formed LLC in Virginia. Registered agent, David Mercer. My brother had formed a company with our last name in the title and attached mine to an application as if I were some silent financial backer waiting in the wings. Daniel leaned back in his chair and looked at me for a long second. This is fraud. I nodded. The word itself didn't hit me as hard as I expected. Maybe because by then I had already lived with a slower, more intimate kind of theft. David had been using my name for years, just socially instead of financially. He had borrowed my silence, my distance, my family role, and turned them into a version of me that served him. This was just the first time it had touched paperwork. I asked Daniel what to do first. He didn't answer immediately. He tore a sheet off the legal pad, drew a line down the middle, and wrote 2 columns: evidence and action. That's when I knew I would be okay. Not because the problem was small, because it had moved into a form I knew how to survive: facts, steps, records, no emotion required to begin. We filed a fraud alert that night. The next morning, I contacted the bank and followed up in writing, stating clearly that I had not consented to any use of my identity or name as guarantor, had no ownership interest in the company, and would dispute any document claiming otherwise. Then I froze my credit with all 3 bureaus, filed an identity theft report, and requested copies of any application materials the bank was legally allowed to preserve in response to a fraud dispute. I did not call David. I did not call my parents. That mattered. Old Elena would have called immediately. She would have demanded an explanation. She would have thought if she just caught the lie early enough and said the right words in the right order, the family would be forced to face what he had done. But I had learned something in those years away from them. When people are invested in a story, confrontation often functions as a warning. It gives them time to clean, align, rewrite, delete. So I said nothing. Instead, I documented. I screenshotted everything, saved the bank emails, printed the fraud report, saved the corporate registration, pulled the hard inquiry date, built a folder on my desktop and another physical folder in a blue accordion file Daniel picked up from the office supply store on his way home. I labeled it simply Mercer. The object itself became strangely important to me, that blue folder, not because it was dramatic, but because it held the opposite of drama. It held sequence. It held proof that the truth existed outside my memory. Every time I slipped another paper into it, I felt a little less like the family's designated exaggerator and a little more like a witness with records. 3 days later, the bank sent partial copies of the disputed application packet. That was the first real blow. David had not only listed me as guarantor, he had attached a scanned signature page with my name typed beneath a signature that was close enough to mine to fool someone moving quickly. He had also included a personal financial summary that referenced family nursing income and a previous Chesapeake address that belonged to my parents' house. Family nursing income. Even in fraud, he had reduced my work to a utility. I stared at that page so long, Daniel finally reached across the table and turned it face down. "You don't need to keep looking at it to know what it is," he said. He was right. Still, I picked it up again a minute later, because some injuries require direct eye contact before they feel real. I wish I could say what hurt most was the forgery. It wasn't. It was the casual certainty underneath it. David had used my name because he believed it was available to him. That belief does not come from nowhere. It comes from years of people letting someone treat you like an extension of family property. Your time, your steadiness, your silence, your reliability. Always there, always useful, always assumed. That weekend, I finally called Marianne. She listened without interrupting. I could hear the hum of her refrigerator through the phone. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I need to tell you something, and you're not going to like it." "Okay. Your father has been putting money into David's deal for months." I closed my eyes. "How much?" "I don't know exactly. Enough that your mother has started worrying and pretending she isn't." That was such a Janice Mercer detail, I almost laughed. Marianne went on. David had been telling the family for over a year that he was building something significant. Mixed-use property, revitalization, retail and residential conversion. All the kinds of phrases people use when they want to sound visionary without getting pinned to specifics. My father, predictably, was proud. My mother had apparently started using the words development project at lunches with friends. And because every family story needs a villain they can point away from themselves, I had become one of David's examples. According to him, he had learned a lot from watching me make irresponsible choices. He said he was determined to do better. I let that sit in silence between us. Then I asked Marianne the only thing that mattered. Did they know he used my name? "No," she said immediately. Not unless he told them some new story. But Elena, they may not believe it if you just call and say it. There it was again, the old architecture. Not truth first, belief first. I know, I said. And I did know. That was the difference now. I was no longer planning for how to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding me. I was planning for how facts move when feelings can't be trusted. The bank's fraud department opened a formal investigation. 2 weeks later, I got a call from an investigator named Mark who had the clipped patience of someone who had heard every lie men like David tell. He asked me to verify my statements, confirm my signature history, and walk him through when I had last had contact with the applicant. At least 6 years, I said. He paused. Family estrangement? Yes. Documented? I almost smiled at that, only in the emotional sense. He made a sound that might have been sympathy, might have been routine acknowledgement. Then he said, I can't tell you where this will go yet, but the application has been frozen. No funds will be released under your guarantor information. That was the first external consequence. Quiet, procedural, invisible to most people. And it was not enough. Not because I wanted revenge. By then, I had stripped myself of that fantasy. Revenge is emotional, messy, personal. What I wanted was separation. A clean, undeniable separation of my name from whatever my brother was building with borrowed money and family mythology. The problem was my parents. Even if the bank shut everything down, even if David got cornered, my parents could still choose his version of events. They could decide I had overreacted, that it was a misunderstanding. That family should handle things privately. That phrase, privately, has covered more wrongdoing in respectable families than anyone likes to admit. I told Daniel that one night while we were eating pasta at the kitchen table, the blue folder between us like a third person. He put his fork down and said, Then don't make it private. I looked at him. He went on carefully, not telling me what to do, just laying out the structure the way he always did. Your family runs on controlled rooms, kitchen table conversations, phone calls, emotional pressure, interruptions, history. If this stays there, you lose. Not because you're wrong, because that system was built without you in mind. I leaned back in my chair. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that if there's going to be a moment where this gets named, it should happen somewhere no one can edit in real time. That was the beginning of the strategy. Not some grand plan, not a trap, just an understanding that truth lands differently when witnesses are present and documents are already in motion. I did not call my parents to accuse David. I did something much simpler. I sent one email. Subject line, We need to discuss a fraud matter involving my name. I copied my mother, my father, David, and Marianne. The body was short. I have been contacted by a bank and fraud investigator regarding a commercial application filed under David's company. My name and forged signature were used without my knowledge or consent. This matter is now formally documented. I will be available to discuss it in person on Thursday at 3 p.m. at Tidewater Business Bank with the investigator present. I will not discuss it by phone. That was all. No emotional language. No accusations beyond what I could already prove. No room for them to claim I was hysterical, confused, or dramatic. Daniel read it once before I sent it. Then he nodded. Good, he said. Now let them react to the structure instead of your pain. They reacted immediately. My mother called 8 minutes later. I let it ring out. My father sent a one-line email. This is not how families handle problems. I wrote back, It is how I handle identity fraud. David waited longer than the others. Almost 2 hours. Then his message came through. I think you are seriously misunderstanding something. That was when I knew I had him. Because innocent people deny facts. David was trying to negotiate reality before the room had even formed. Thursday afternoon was the first time I saw my family in 6 years. And it was not at a kitchen table. It was in a bank conference room with fluorescent lights, a glass wall, a pitcher of water nobody touched, and a blue folder in front of me thick enough to change the balance of the table. I arrived 15 minutes early. Not because I was nervous, though I was, because I wanted to sit in that room before they entered it. I wanted a few quiet minutes to look at the table, the glass wall, the notepad placed in front of each chair, and remind myself that this was not my parents' kitchen. No one here had the authority to talk over me just because they had done it before. The conference room was on the second floor of the bank, tucked behind a row of offices with frosted doors and framed photographs of local business openings. It smelled faintly like printer toner and carpet cleaner. The table was oval, dark wood, polished enough to reflect the overhead lights. There were 6 chairs. I took the one facing the door. Mark, the fraud investigator, came in a minute later carrying a slim gray file and a legal pad. He was in his 50s, maybe, with rolled shirt sleeves and the kind of expression that never gave away more than it had to. He shook my hand, thanked me for coming, and sat down at the far end of the table. Then we waited. At 3:02, the elevator doors opened down the hall. I heard my father before I saw him. His stride was still the same. Heavy, purposeful, built to suggest certainty, even when certainty had started to crack. My mother came in first, though, in a cream blouse and tan slacks, her hair blown smooth and careful, like she had prepared for a difficult lunch rather than a fraud meeting. David was behind them in a navy blazer with no tie, carrying himself with that same polished calm he had used his whole life when he thought charm could outrun facts. For a second, none of them recognized me. That was the strangest part. It wasn't that I looked wildly different. I was still myself. Same height, same face, same dark hair, though shorter now, tucked behind one ear. But I was sitting straight at a conference table with a bank investigator beside me and a file in front of me, and my family had apparently never imagined me in any setting that implied authority. Then my mother's eyes landed on me fully and widened. Elena. My father stopped in the doorway. David's expression barely shifted, but I saw it. The quick tightening around the mouth. The 1-second delay while he recalculated. No one moved to hug me. Thank God. Mark stood, introduced himself, gestured to the chairs, and waited while they sat down. My father took the chair opposite me. My mother took the one beside him. David sat nearest the door, as if some part of him had already made a plan for leaving. No one touched the water. Mark began exactly the way I hoped he would. Calm, formal, no room for family tone to creep in. Thank you all for coming. This meeting concerns a disputed commercial lending application submitted under Mercer Redevelopment Holdings, specifically, the unauthorized use of Miss Elena Mercer's identity and purported guarantor signature on application materials. I'm here to review the facts as established so far and document any clarifications any of you wish to provide. My father looked at him, then at me, then back at Mark. This seems excessive, he said. Surely if there's been some misunderstanding, we can resolve it without making it sound criminal. There it was, 4 minutes in, and already he was trying to reduce the shape of the room. Mark did not blink. Identity misuse on a lending application is a serious matter, Mr. Mercer. Whether it was a misunderstanding or a deliberate act is exactly what is under review. My father leaned back hard in his chair. My mother folded her hands too tightly in her lap. David gave a small, rueful smile, the one he used when he wanted to look like the calmest person in the room. I'm sure this got messy on paper, he said. But no one was trying to harm Elena. I remember looking at him and thinking, with almost clinical detachment, you still believe tone can save you. Mark opened his file. For the record, he said, the application package included a personal guarantor page bearing Miss Mercer's typed name, a signature currently under dispute, and a personal financial summary referring to her income. Miss Mercer has stated she did not authorize any use of her identity, has no ownership position in the applicant entity, and has had no involvement in the project. He turned one sheet and slid a copy halfway across the table. This is the page in question. My mother looked down first, then my father, then David. I watched my father's eyes fix on the signature. Even now, after everything, a small part of me expected him to look at me and ask, "Did you sign this?" Not because I wanted the question, but because at least it would have been a question, an opening, proof that he understood facts belonged to all of us. He didn't ask. Instead, he looked at David and said, "What is this?" David didn't pick up the paper. It's exactly what I said. It got messy. That line hung in the room for one beat too long. I spoke then, for the first time since they arrived. My signature didn't get messy, David. It got forged. My own voice surprised me. Not because it shook, because it didn't. It came out level, almost quiet. The kind of voice that makes everyone else lower theirs without meaning to. My mother finally looked directly at me. Really looked. I hadn't seen her do that in years. Her eyes went to the folder in front of me, the clipped stack of documents, the pen aligned beside the notepad, and something in her expression shifted from offense to uncertainty. "Elena," she said carefully, "why didn't you come to us first?" I almost laughed. Not loudly. Just one short breath of disbelief. Come to you first, I repeated. About David using my identity? My father's jaw tightened. That's not what your mother means. No, I said. I think it is. The room went still. It wasn't anger moving through me. That's the part people always get wrong when they imagine confrontation. By then, I wasn't angry in the hot sense. I was clear, and clarity has its own temperature. I opened the blue folder. I took out the disputed signature page, my credit freeze confirmations, the fraud alert filings, the copy of the bank email, the LLC registration, and the timeline Daniel and I had assembled. I set each piece down in front of me in order. Not dramatically, just precisely. Then I slid one copy toward my father and one toward my mother. I came to you 6 years ago, I said. When David told you I'd been fired, when he said I was lying, I called, I emailed, I mailed a letter. You blocked me. Mom sent it back unopened. My mother's face changed as soon as I said that. Not because the memory surprised her, because it didn't. I kept going. So no, I did not come to you first this time. I went where records matter. David gave a low exhale through his nose. This is unbelievable. Mark turned his head slightly toward him. Mr. Mercer, this would be a good time to explain how your sister's guarantor information came to appear in the application. David finally leaned forward, elbows on the table, as if adopting a more serious posture could help him now. My understanding, he said, was that family support was going to be part of the package. We were moving fast. Some draft materials got included before everything was finalized. I stared at him. Family support. That was the phrase he chose. Not forgery. Not unauthorized. Family support. Mark asked. Did Miss Mercer ever agree to serve as guarantor? David didn't answer immediately, which in itself was an answer. Then he said, not explicitly. The investigator's pen moved once across his pad. My father looked from him to me to David. The rhythm of his breathing had changed. I could hear it. You used her name without asking? David turned to him, still trying to keep the tone reasonable. Dad, it wasn't like that. How was it? I asked. He looked back at me. For 1 second, the charm fell out completely. I saw irritation. Actual irritation. As if I had become inconvenient by existing in a form that documented itself. I was trying to secure a project, he said. I knew the family would stand behind it in the end. The family? I asked. Or me? He opened his hands. It's the same thing. No, I said. It isn't. That landed harder than I expected, maybe because it was the real argument under everything. In my family, I had never been treated as a separate person where David was concerned. I was the reliable extension, the older sister, the quiet one, the one whose steadiness could be assumed, borrowed, represented, interpreted. Even now, sitting across from me in a bank conference room, he was still arguing from that premise, that my name lived inside the family and therefore inside his reach. My mother had gone very pale. Elena, she said softly, did you really send letters? I looked at her. That question, that tiny, belated, devastating question. I reached into the folder and took out a photocopy of the blue card I had mailed years earlier, along with the postal receipt and the returned envelope marked in her handwriting. I set them in front of her without a word. She stared at the envelope. Her fingers touched the edge of it, then pulled back. My father looked too. I watched recognition move across his face in slow, ugly stages. He knew her handwriting. Of course he did. He knew that black marker, knew the pressure of the strokes. Knew in one glance that this was real. David tried one more time. This has nothing to do with that, he said quickly. You're dragging old family issues into a business misunderstanding. That was when Mark finally intervened in a way that changed the whole room. Actually, he said, closing his folder, patterns of contact and prior credibility disputes are often relevant when unauthorized use occurs within families, especially when the disputed party has been positioned in a way that reduces the likelihood of immediate challenge. Silence. I felt it before I fully processed it. The shift. Until that moment, this could still have been cast as a private conflict, a sibling disagreement, emotional history contaminating a financial conversation. But the second a neutral third party named the pattern out loud, the room changed shape. Suddenly, the architecture David had built around me, dramatic, unreliable, distant, was not protecting him. It was evidence. My father looked at David the way I had never seen him look at him before. Not proud. Not frustrated, not indulgent. Appraising. Did you tell us she stole from the hospital? He asked. David went still. No one moved. My father's voice got quieter, which was always when he was most serious. Answer me. David's eyes flicked toward my mother, then me, then the investigator. I told you what I believed at the time. No, I said. You didn't. He looked at me sharply. I held his gaze and kept my voice even. You told them I was fired. You told them I was lying. You told them I'd make up a story if they confronted me. You said it because you needed me cut off from the family before you started using my name. My mother made a sound then. Not a word. A small broken intake of breath, like something inside her had finally aligned in the worst possible way. David shook his head. That's ridiculous. Is it? I asked. Because the bank called me by accident. If they hadn't, how long would you have let my name sit on that application? How long before I found out through collections or litigation or damage to my credit? Another month? 6? Would you have told Mom and Dad that was my fault too? He didn't answer. He looked angry now. Really angry. Not theatrical. Stripped. The kind of anger that comes when someone realizes the old methods won't work. My father stood up so suddenly his chair scraped against the floor. For a second I thought he was going to shout. That would have been familiar. Easier, in a way. But he didn't. He stood there with both hands on the table, looking down at the documents, then at David, and said one sentence in a voice I barely recognized. What else have you lied about? That was the moment. Not because it fixed anything, it didn't, not yet. But because it was the first time in my life I watched my father ask David a real question instead of handing him belief. My mother was crying silently by then, one hand pressed over her mouth. David stood too. This is insane, he said. You're all acting like I committed some kind of crime over paperwork that never even went through. Mark's expression stayed unreadable. Attempted identity misuse does not become harmless because a bank caught it. David turned toward the door, as if movement itself might save him. My father said, "Sit down." It came out low and rough, but it carried more force than any shout he had ever used on me. David stopped. He did not sit. Instead, he said, "You have no idea what I've been carrying for this family." I remember the exact look on my mother's face then. Not confusion, recognition. A woman realizing too late that she had mistaken performance for devotion for years because performance had been easier to live with. I closed the folder. I didn't need to say more. That was the strange power of the moment. For once, I did not have to over-explain. The documents were there. The investigator was there. My father had asked the question. The room had already shifted. So when Mark asked whether I wished to pursue every available corrective action, I answered without looking at David. Yes, I said. I want my name fully removed from any and all materials. I want the dispute preserved in writing. And I want formal confirmation that I am not financially connected to this company in any way. He nodded once. Understood. My father sank slowly back into his chair. My mother was still staring at the returned envelope. David finally sat down again, but he looked different now. Smaller, somehow. Not because his lies had vanished. Because they no longer controlled the room. No one hugged me when the meeting ended. No one asked whether we could all go somewhere private and talk. My father could not seem to look at me directly. My mother did, but only in quick, shattered glances, as if the full sight of me had become too expensive. David left first. Of course he did. He pushed through the conference room door, with his jaw locked and his phone already in his hand, probably searching for the next version of events before the current one fully settled. I stayed behind long enough to sign the final dispute statement. When I stepped into the hallway, my mother was waiting by the elevator with both hands wrapped around her purse strap like she needed something to hold. "Elena," she said. I stopped, but I did not step closer. There are moments when distance is the only honest thing you can offer. She looked older than I remembered. Not older in years, older in the face. Like the effort of holding a false story together had finally shown up where everyone could see it. "I should have asked you," she said. I did not rescue her from that sentence. I did not say it was okay. I did not tell her she had been manipulated, though she had. I did not smooth it over to make it easier for her to bear. I just said, yes. The elevator doors opened behind her. My father was already inside, staring at the floor. My mother nodded once, small and broken, then stepped backward into the elevator. The doors closed between us. I stood there for a second in the quiet hall with the blue folder under my arm and the bank's stamped confirmation papers in my hand. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Because exposure is one thing, consequences are another. And once the truth left that conference room, it started moving through my family, the bank, and my father's money in ways even David could not charm back into place. The first consequence arrived before I even made it to my car. By the time I pulled out of the bank parking lot, I already had 2 voicemails from my mother and 1 from my father. I didn't listen to them there. I drove home with the radio off and both hands steady on the wheel, the blue folder on the passenger seat like it belonged there now. When I got home, Daniel was at the dining table with his laptop open, waiting without hovering. He looked up when I walked in, took one look at my face, and stood. "Well?" he asked. I set the folder down, took off my shoes, and said, "My father finally asked him a question." Daniel understood immediately. He always did. He came over, touched the back of my neck once, light and warm, then let me talk. I told him everything, the forged signature, my mother seeing the returned envelope, Mark naming the pattern in the room, my father standing up, David trying to call identity fraud a misunderstanding. That last one almost made Daniel laugh, but not quite. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "That's the first real thing that's happened in 6 years," he said. He was right. Not the most dramatic thing, the most real. That night I listened to the voicemails. My mother's came first. She was crying too hard to stay coherent for the first 30 seconds. Then I heard my own name the way she used to say it when I was little and had fallen off my bike. Soft. Scared. "Elena, please call me. Please. I didn't know. I need you to believe that I didn't know." My father's voicemail was different. No tears. Just a voice I barely recognized, flat. "Heavy. I need to speak with you." That was it. No explanation, no defense, no apology. But I heard something I had never heard from him before. No certainty. I did not call either of them back that night. That also mattered. Not as punishment, as structure. I had spent too many years responding on the first ring, the first accusation, the first demand. I was done letting their urgency set my pace. So I made dinner with Daniel. I showered. I fed the cat. I folded a load of towels. Then I sat on the sofa with the blue folder on my lap and listened to the house settle around me. That was the new life I had built. Quiet rooms. Chosen steadiness. No one slamming a narrative down on top of me before I had a chance to think. The bank sent formal confirmation 3 business days later that my guarantor status had been voided, my identity dispute had been preserved in the file, and the application was suspended pending further review. 2 days after that, Marianne called. She didn't bother with small talk. "Your father cut David off." I sat down at the kitchen table. "What do you mean, cut him off?" "I mean financially first. Maybe emotionally too. But we'll see if he has the stamina for that. He's pulling all support. The project money, the line of credit help, all of it." There was shouting. "Your mother told me she's never seen him like that." I looked out the window over the sink. Our tiny backyard was full of late afternoon light. Somebody 2 houses over was mowing their grass. Ordinary life. Again. Always ordinary life, moving right alongside collapse. What did David say? Marianne gave a dry little sigh. Everything. That it was temporary, that everyone does this in business, that you were overreacting. Then, when that didn't work, he said he only used your name because he knew you'd never let the family fail if it came down to it. That line sat in me like a stone. Not because it surprised me, because it was true in the ugliest possible way. Not the fraud, the logic under it. David had built his whole adult life on the assumption that my steadiness was a family asset available for redistribution. He had counted on me being exactly who I had always been. Quiet, competent, slow to make scenes, willing to absorb damage rather than make other people uncomfortable. He simply had not accounted for what happens when a quiet person stops protecting the system that taught them to be quiet. Marianne kept talking. The bank had apparently begun asking for revised documentation on the project. Investors were getting nervous. My father had realized the numbers were not what he had been led to believe. Some of the committed support David had represented was smoke. Some of the projected occupancy figures looked inflated. It wasn't just my name. It was the whole structure around the deal. Optimism padded into fact. That is another way families lie. Not just with stories, with tone, with confidence, with selective vagueness that everyone agrees not to examine too closely because they like what believing it says about them. Within 2 weeks, The project stalled completely. One local investor withdrew, then another. Without my name in the file and with the fraud review attached to the application history, nobody wanted the risk. My father had enough pride to hate the embarrassment and enough business sense to recognize rot once it had a paper trail. My mother called every few days during that period. Sometimes I let it go to voicemail. Sometimes I answered and kept the conversation under 5 minutes. She apologized in loops at first. Not maliciously, desperately. The mind does strange things when it is trying to rewrite itself without actually tolerating the full amount of guilt at once. She would say, "I should have listened," then slide into, "You know how convincing David can be," and I would stop her there. "Yes," I said once, "he can, but you were convinced because his version was easier on you." That silence on the line was worth more than any dramatic confrontation. It was the silence of a person being forced to look directly at her own convenience. My father took longer. For nearly 3 weeks, he communicated only by one-line text. "Can we talk?" "I'm trying." "I know that isn't enough." Then one Saturday morning, he sent something different. "Can I come by myself?" I stared at the message for a long time. Daniel was making coffee. The kettle had just started to hiss. He looked over at me and knew immediately something had shifted. "What is it?" "My father," I said. "He wants to come here, alone." Daniel leaned against the counter and waited. He never rushed my decisions, which is one of the reasons I trusted him with the life that came after my family. "What do you want?" he asked. Not what should I do? Not what will make peace. What do you want? That question still felt like a luxury sometimes. I thought about it carefully. Not the fantasy version. The real one. Not a healed father. Not a cinematic apology. Just a man in his 60s who had spent most of his life confusing authority with truth. "I want to hear what he says when there's no one else in the room to perform for," I said. So he came that afternoon. He stood on our front porch holding nothing in his hands, which somehow made him look more uncomfortable than flowers or some apology gift would have. He wore a navy windbreaker and khaki pants, and the expression of a man who had reached an age where other people's houses still made him feel like a guest when he knew he deserved to be one. I let him in. He stood in the foyer for a second, looking around at framed prints, the bookshelf, the bench by the door where Daniel kept his keys. A whole life. Mine. One he had never asked to see. "Nice place," he said. "Thank you." I did not offer coffee immediately. I did not rescue the moment. I let him feel it. We sat at the dining table, the same second-hand one Daniel and I had put together on the floor with an Allen wrench and takeout containers between us. Sunlight hit one corner of it through the window. There was a water ring near the edge from a plant I kept meaning to move. My father looked at his hands for a while before he spoke. "When your mother said you mailed a letter, I thought she must have made some mistake," he said. I told myself there had to be some explanation. I waited. He let out a breath through his nose. There wasn't. No tears. No dramatic break. Just that sentence, placed on the table between us. Then he did something my father had almost never done in my entire life. He told the truth without arranging himself to look good inside it. He said he had always found David easier because David admired him in a way I never had, that my quietness made him feel judged even when I was saying nothing, that he had mistaken my reserve for disapproval and my competence for distance, that when David came to him with stories about me being unstable, dishonest, difficult, some part of him had been ready to believe it because it made our estrangement feel less like his failure. There it was, ugly, human, real. Not a complete explanation, but a true one. I asked him the question I had carried for 6 years. "Why didn't you ask me?" He looked up then, really looked at me, and said, "Because I thought if I called, I might hear something that made me ashamed." I sat very still. That was one of the deepest cuts of the whole story. Not because it was cruel, because it was so ordinary. So many families destroy themselves not through grand evil, but through the daily avoidance of shame. People refuse one phone call, one question, one moment of humility, and years grow around that refusal like vines around a dead fence. He apologized then, not elegantly. My father was never going to become fluent in emotional language at 63, but he apologized specifically, for the calls not returned, for the letter, for choosing the son who made him feel important over the daughter who might have required him to become honest. Specificity matters. It is the difference between remorse and relief-seeking. I told him I believed he was sorry. Then I told him sorry was not repair. He nodded. A tired, devastated nod. I know, he said. And for the first time in my life, I think he did. My mother came a week later. That conversation was harder in a different way. My father had always been blunt enough that when he cracked, you could see the line. My mother was made of softer evasions. She had spent a lifetime calling passivity peace and calling silence kindness. Untangling that took longer. She cried. Of course she cried, but she also listened. I showed her the photocopy of the returned envelope again. I showed her the printout of the first email I had sent 6 years earlier with the subject line, "Please just call me back." I watched her read it with her hand over her mouth. "I told myself you were angry," she whispered. "I told myself if you really wanted us, you would keep trying." I looked at her. I called 12 times. She cried harder then, but I did not soften the fact to spare her. That is something I learned in those years apart. Compassion without clarity is how you end up back inside the same machinery that hurt you. So I gave them both a boundary, not a performance. If they wanted a relationship with me, it would be slow. Separate from David. No family pressure. No holidays as proof. No demands for instant healing because the truth had finally become expensive for them too. They would not show up and expect to be folded neatly into the life I built without them. They would enter as people who had lost access and might, over time, earn a different kind. To my surprise, they accepted that. Not gracefully every time. My mother still reached too fast sometimes. My father still went stiff when a conversation got close to real vulnerability. But they came. They texted. They asked, before dropping by. They learned my schedule. Daniel was polite but not cozy with them, which I appreciated more than I can explain. Trust that is handed out cheaply has never impressed me. As for David, he called once. One voicemail. No apology. Not really. He said he thought things had spiraled. He said the project pressure had been intense. He said families should be able to make mistakes without being destroyed by them. Destroyed by them. That was his phrase. I listened to it twice, then deleted it. I did not call him back. Months later, Marianne told me he had moved to North Carolina, supposedly for a fresh start. I did not ask for details. Distance was enough. I was no longer interested in monitoring the consequences of his character. I had spent enough of my life orbiting damage that was not mine. About 4 months after the bank meeting, my parents came to dinner for the first time. Nothing cinematic happened. That matters too. No swelling music. No perfect speech. My mother brought roasted carrots nobody asked for. My father stood awkwardly in the kitchen for a while before finally asking Daniel whether he could help set the table. Daniel handed him plates and said, "Sure." I watched my father count out 4 place settings on our dining table with the careful concentration of a man performing a task he understood was smaller than what it represented. 4 plates. For some reason that nearly undid me more than any apology had. Because it was so ordinary, so late, so insufficient, and still, somehow, real. During dinner, my mother asked me about work and actually listened to the answer. My father asked Daniel about a community center project he was designing and did not interrupt him once. When they left, my mother hugged me carefully, like she knew I might not always want it. My father touched my shoulder and said, "Thank you for having us." No declarations. No claims that we were healed. Just that. Sometimes people ask whether I forgave them. I don't think that is the most useful question. Forgiveness gets talked about like a door, open or closed. But what happened in my family was not one event. It was an architecture, years of favoritism, convenience, image, silence. One lie only worked because a whole structure was already there waiting to hold it up. What I did was not forgiveness in the clean, shiny way people like to imagine. What I did was decide not to carry the entire building by myself anymore. I kept what was mine: my work, my marriage, my home, my name, my pace, my boundaries. And then, from that steadier place, I allowed a few doors to open under conditions I controlled. That is different. It is quieter, less impressive, and much more useful. Now, when I think back to the bank conference room, I don't picture David's face first. I don't even picture the forged signature. I picture the blue folder. That folder is still in my office closet. I kept it because it reminds me of something I wish I had learned much younger. Evidence matters. So do witnesses. So does refusing to argue your life inside rooms that were designed to misunderstand you. I spent too many years believing that if I just explained myself well enough, the right people would finally hear me. What I know now is simpler. People who benefit from your silence rarely become fair just because you speak. Sometimes the truth needs a table, a paper trail, and a room where no one can interrupt long enough to bend it. I'm 34 years old. I still work in emergency medicine. I still keep my sentences shorter than most people expect when I'm upset. Daniel still leaves his coffee cup in the sink instead of the dishwasher and claims this is a reasonable adult choice. My mother texts me recipes now. My father sends me photos from the hardware store when he's trying to fix something and wants my opinion for no clear reason except that asking seems to matter to him. We are not a perfect family. We are not even a repaired one in the neat sense. But we are, at least, no longer living inside the lie my brother built. And that, for me, is enough. The last time my parents came over, my father stood in the kitchen holding a stack of plates and asked, "4?" I looked up from the stove and said, "4." Then he set them down one by one, carefully, like they mattered. And for the first time in a very long time, so did I.